Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 8 lecture, where today we're going to be discussing residential community supervision programs. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the purpose of residential community correctional facilities, discuss the effectiveness of residential community correctional programs for medium and high-risk offenders, as well as to compare and contrast halfway houses, shock incarceration, and work release programs. So when we're talking about community correction programs, we need to understand that they are intermediate sanctions. So these are sentencing options between prison and probation that are going to provide more freedom than prison would, but less freedom than traditional probation. Included within this would be halfway houses, work release programs, and correctional boot camps. So let's begin by discussing halfway houses. So these are your most common types of community residential facility, and they're also the oldest. These halfway houses are also typically staffed 24/7. So understand that halfway houses are a form of a residential community correctional facility. So again, included in those RCCFs are going to be things such as pre-release centers, restitution centers, drug treatment facilities, as well as work release centers, and we'll go through those later throughout this lecture. So halfway houses are going to be more structured than independent living settings, and they can be used either as a sentence themselves, so someone could be sentenced to attend a halfway house, or they can be used as transitional housing for sex offenders who are having trouble finding housing when they have to comply with all of those housing and housing laws where they can't live within so many feet of schools, parks, etc. So 90% of our RCCFs in the United States are actually privately owned and operated. We'll talk more about that. But the average cost per day for an inmate is around $45. So we need to understand the history of halfway houses and how we got here. So they actually date back to England and Ireland in the early 1800s, and they originated in the United States to solely provide food and shelter for offenders. So they originated at a time when penitentiaries still followed the Pennsylvania system of solitude and complete silence. However, in the 1950s, we started to have concerns of high crime rates and high parole revocation, which prompted these halfway houses to start providing treatment, and they were also then less expensive than putting these offenders in prisons, but they also provided protection for the communities. So these penitentiaries started moving to the Auburn congregate system, where silent interaction was permitted and inmates were able to work. So this happened about the same time. Then in the 1960s, these halfway houses started to receive government assistance for the very first time as a direct result of the Safe Streets Act of 1968. And today, most of our halfway houses are privately owned as an alternative, and they're used as an alternative to prison. And they're privately owned because state and public support for them was lacking. So private nonprofit corporations decided to start opening them up. And that's how they became mostly privately owned. So some jurisdictions will rely on these more than others will. And when we look at private halfway houses, they actually are able to choose the type of client that they will serve and the type of client that they will accept in. So you may have to have certain charges, or you may not be able to have certain types of charges. It can depend on your age. It can depend on your prior criminal history. What current issues are you presenting with? Some of them may focus more on drugs and alcohol. Some of them may take a more holistic approach and provide education and treatment. So these halfway houses then contract with the government for a specific per diem rate per day per offender, which was about that $45. And offenders are expected to assist financially with this payment, and it's charged to them as a form of rent for them staying at the halfway house. So what does a halfway house program look like? Well, there is no average residential facility. However, they are going to share certain features. So each halfway house is going to be unique in its structure, the treatment programs that are offered, and again, the type of offender that they're going to serve. So the offender is going to assist in that per diem rate and pay about 25% to help ease the cost to taxpayers. Because remember, if these private organizations are charging the government and the counties and the states, it's coming out of tax dollars. So a lot of these facilities, they're not going to have fences or locks, so the offender could technically leave if they wanted to. And the offender is going to be expected to complete chores while they're living there, to complete community service hours, participate in counseling, participate in classes, and even have make sure they're taking drug screens and passing those drug screens. So these offenders are going to live in the facility. Most times they're required to be employed, and they can leave the facility to go to work at that verified job. They also must keep current on their rent, which is that 25% that they need to pay. And typically they need to be approved for leave for reasons other than work. So while they can leave for certain circumstances, typically these are going to be more life-altering or life-changing events that they would be permitted to attend, such as maybe funerals or other life-altering events that would be very important for one to attend, not just that they want to go hang out with their buddy Johnny this weekend. So these halfway houses are going to operate on a level system. So this is a form of behavior modification where freedoms are earned based on the offender's behavior, which must be good while they're in the program, how much time they've spent within the program, and what their current financial situation is. So, are they abiding by the rules of the program? Are they coming in on their curfew when they're supposed to? Are they maintaining their job? Are they attending their job? Are they getting paid by that job? And are they making sure that they're up on their rent with the halfway house? So once an offender in this level system, once an offender is showing that they can do all of these things, they'll start to be given hour passes, then maybe a day pass to go somewhere. And understand these are ones that will typically then be able to be used for more fun recreational activities. But this is only once they've proved that they're following along the program. They may even be able to get weekend passes, driving privileges, and a later curfew. These are just a few examples. And then when the offender is ready to transition out, typically aftercare may be offered by some of the programs, and this is just to help ensure a successful re-entry for that offender and make sure that they're following up on any of that additional counseling, education, or treatment that they needed. So what does successful completion of an RCCF look like? Well, the offender should be better readjusted to the community and to society. They should be able to have conversations with individuals, not be engaging in criminal activities. They should be engaging in pro-social activities. Finding a job can be considered success for an offender, and maintaining that job. Also abstaining from drugs and alcohol. And successfully completing can also look like having closer familial relationships, because a lot of these offenders, as we know, can have broken down relationships with their families, their loved ones, because of the crimes they've committed or because of the alcohol and drugs that they've used. And finally, they should be able to financially assist their families and support their families and support their dependent children. So now we need to take a different look at this and address how the staff views supervision and treatment within these halfway houses. So we need to look at this through the dual role relationship theory. So this model explains how community service officers will engage in both rule enforcement and monitoring, as well as therapeutic and treatment to effectively supervise their clients. So you see here that you have client managers, which are going to be more security oriented, making sure the offender is coming in on curfew, that they're taking their drug screens, that they're going to their jobs, that they're where they say they should be. And then you have add that with the case manager aspect, where you're looking at the treatment and rehabilitation portion. So if you look at these, they combine to create this dual role relationship theory. But can you see any issues that could come about from this, having to play both of these roles, where you need to be not only security oriented, but treatment and rehabilitation oriented? Sometimes certain officers will find it difficult to balance these two. You need to have a fair amount of security and make sure that you can keep your offender in compliance, but you also need to make sure that you can support them in their treatment. So looking then at RCCFs for female offenders. So many women offenders are actually good candidates for RCCFs because they're nonviolent offenders. So most women are going to commit nonviolent property and drug crimes. They're not typically a threat to public safety. They don't require a prison sentence. And a lot of them have issues with transportation, so they have a difficult time getting a job, and they sometimes will lack funds to get a car. So by placing these women in these RCCFs, they can help them to obtain a job and also assist with the transportation issue. But again, it's important that these RCCFs are going to address gender-specific issues, and this concern has grown over the years to make sure that they are addressing those gender-specific issues. For example, women tend to have higher rates of drug and alcohol use. So we also want to focus on not only their use of drugs and alcohol, but how does that, as well as their involvement in the CJ system, affect their dependent children. So children that come from incarcerated parents are at risk for suffering emotional, developmental, and economical damage when that parent is incarcerated. So for example, one of these female offender halfway houses, or RCCFs, is called the John Crane House. So this is in Indiana, and it actually allows the women offenders to live with their dependent children. Now they do have an age limit of how old the child can be to be in the John Crane House, but the whole goal here is to provide a more individualized and specialized attention on the fact that these women are primary caregivers to these dependent children, and that we want to make sure that these children have the emotional safety and security they need from their mothers, that they're not being affected developmentally or even economically from not having a parent who's able to work because they're incarcerated. So rather, these women can enter the John Crane House, where they're going to learn emotional and economic independence so that they can effectively care for their children. So do RCCFs work? That's what we always want to know, right? Are the programs that we're using actually beneficial? So we have found that those that are located in more disadvantaged and transient neighborhoods where people are moving in and out frequently, they typically tend to provide lower quality services. So unfortunately, we don't see the great success that we would in other areas. Halfway house clients also tend to have less revocations for technical violations, but rearrest, reconviction, and reincarceration rates are no different than those who would spend time in prison. So a reason for having less revocations for technical violations could just be simply due to the increased surveillance that the program has over the offender while they're in these programs. So within a 5-year follow-up period, one study found that 13% had committed a new crime and were now incarcerated. 50% were unsuccessfully discharged due to technical violations, but 37% were successfully discharged. So they are somewhat effective. Now, we understand that employment is one of the main factors to ensure that offenders are not going to continue down the path of criminality. We want to make sure that offenders are employed. So going along with where offenders can work in halfway houses, we also have these work release programs. So this is a program where an offender resides in a facility, and they're released into the community only to attend work and sometimes educational classes. The goal of this is to help control institutional crowding. So if you can have some inmates going out of the facility for a majority of the day, you can help ease that crowding. It also provides the offender with an opportunity to retain their employment that they had prior to going into incarceration. So eligibility will vary to be able to participate in a work release program. Obviously, we want to make sure that the offender is not a flight risk, that if they are a violent offender, that maybe they have shown that they've been able to comply with prison regulations for a while, they have very good behavior while they're incarcerated, and now we can give them this opportunity. And very interestingly, I think, is that this Pinal County Jail actually uses iris recognition technology to ensure that they're releasing the right offender out into their work release program. So I think that's very interesting and honestly a very good idea, because we want to make sure that we have the proper offenders being released out of the facility, and that we don't, say, release a very violent offender or a sex offender by accident simply because they may have similar features and the correctional officer is not necessarily the best at identifying who is who. So there's going to be two types of these work release programs. You have either unsupervised work release or supervised work release. So unsupervised is where the offender is going to check out in the morning and they just have to make sure that they return to the jail by a certain time. So they will need to find their own transportation to their job, but they may have fellow employees picking them up. So they just need to make sure that they come back to the facility by a certain time. Supervised work release is where a group of offenders are going to leave together, and typically correctional officers are going to stay with them and supervise the work that they're doing. So that group is going to stay with the group for the day, and then they all are going to return at the same time. So these work release programs do actually reduce reoffending, and not surprisingly, it increases earning capabilities for those offenders so that they can keep current on their fines, their costs, suppose paying back restitution, making child support payments. And offenders also understand, however, that an offender who either leaves a work site or who does not return on time, whether it's through unsupervised or supervised work release, will have a warrant issued for their arrest. These jails are not playing games, and we're not going to just give the offender, as we maybe would give more chances if an offender's on probation. You may give them a couple more chances to check in with you. If the offender doesn't come in by a certain time that night, they're getting an arrest warrant issued. So continuing on with this idea of work release programs, we have a bit more of a restitution center. So this is specifically targeted to work-capable offenders who owe large amounts of restitution to a victim or victims. These offenders to participate typically have to be minimum custody level and have less than 6 months to go until they're going to be released. So the center here will actually collect the money from the offender's check, and they will disperse it first to restitution, to their rent, to food, to any child support payments they may have, and even transportation to ensure that the offender has either train passes, bus passes, and then the offender is given just a very small allowance of discretionary funds to do with as they please. So it's really a way to help the offender learn how to budget and also ensure that they're making the necessary payments they need to make others whole who they owe. So these are similar to the halfway houses where the offender is going to pay rent to be here. So there's a big focus here on having stable employment and being sure that we're paying back the victim. So examples of these are the Texas Restitution Centers or Texas Transitional Treatment Centers, where the offender must remain employed, but they also offer them GED classes, life skills classes, cognitive restructuring. They may even offer individual and family counseling. And they found that offenders actually completed community service that equaled approximately $600,000 in labor costs. So these offenders are being able to give back to their communities through community service work as well. And then there's a Florida Work Release Center where the staff will actually visit the job site weekly, and they found that these offenders had higher employment rates and increased earnings when compared to those offenders who were not in the program. Continuing on with the idea of work. I cannot stress employment and work enough, and neither do our prisons, our community correctional facilities. We understand that work and keeping idle hands busy is very important to an offender's success. So work ethic camps are minimum custody facilities. They're typically a 120-day alternative to the offender going to prison. And the goal here is that we're going to teach job skills as well as decision making using a cognitive behavioral approach. This is then followed up with intensive supervision probation typically. And we can combine work release with therapeutic communities in these work ethic camps. So the CREST program is one example of that, where eligibility is based on completion of a drug and alcohol education course, counseling, as well as confrontation courses, so understanding how to confront someone in a pro-social manner. They found that those who completed the program did have lower relapse and lower recidivism rates. Now, shock incarceration, we're going to take a bit of a turn here. And now, as much as we understand employment is important, sometimes certain offenders will require the harsh realities of prison. So shock incarceration is simply a brief period of incarceration followed by a term of supervised probation. So the target here is on young offenders who don't have a prior incarceration history, because the hope is that the harsh reality of prison will deter that offender from future offending and violating because they don't want to go back. So these have also been referred to as shock probation, shock parole, intermittent imprisonment, split sentence, and boot camps. So let's talk about correctional boot camps. So they first began in Georgia in 1983, and it's a form of shock incarceration that is going to involve a military-style regimen designed to instill both discipline in young offenders while also providing treatment. So some common characteristics of correctional boot camps are intensive physical training, having the offenders engage in hard labor, having drills and ceremonies very similar to the military, and they're rigid in structure. So it's not just like the halfway houses where the offender can go to work, they might attend some programs, but they have a little more freedom. These are very rigid and the offender must follow along with the program. So there's two types. So you can have those that are inside prison walls, and this is where an offender is going to be chosen specifically by prison administration. So these offenders are actually going to be separated from other inmates, and typically upon graduation, they'll be paroled. Then you have those that are standalone community facilities where an offender is chosen by a judge to participate in the program. And once that probationer completes the program, they will typically graduate then into intensive supervision probation or regular probation. The typical length for the program is about 90 to 190 days. It can depend on the program itself, as well as the offender's compliance with the program. And it's important to know that at the end of the day, it is voluntary, very similar to how our specialty courts that we covered were. These are voluntarily participated in by the offenders, and they're selected from the prison population. So how successful are boot camps? Well, to have a successful boot camp, we've learned that we need to incorporate education and treatment into these strict regimens. Simply having a very rigid structure, giving them hard labor, making them follow rules and drills, does not actually change the offender's behavior long term. And having intensive aftercare is very important so that the offender retains what they've learned within that boot camp and the time they spent in there. There are some short-term positives that come out of this. So offenders typically have positive attitude changes, as well as medical, and it has weight loss benefits as well because they're engaging in a lot of physical labor and physical activity in the program. Criticisms, however, of boot camps say that we have this concern of net widening, which we covered earlier in the semester. So net widening is when you simply have you target a larger group of offenders that may not necessarily need the treatment, but you're giving it to them anyway. So this could also lead to an increase in cost, and it's net widening because you're putting them in the program because you don't want to incarcerate them, but they may not necessarily need a boot camp. There's also no evidence that these programs decrease recidivism for offenders. And the confrontational style can actually have negative outcomes by decreasing an offender's self-esteem, which we know is one thing that we want to increase and that we know employment actually increases with offenders. It can also increase the potential for the offender to engage in violence because it is such a military structured type of program. And it can also encourage an abuse of power when you have this hierarchy of drill sergeants and such. So those are just some criticisms of the boot camps. So in sum, RCCF offenders, pose a higher risk and typically have more treatment needs than traditional probationers will. Halfway houses are very valuable to us in the residential community programs ARENA for reentry of offenders. Residential programs for female offenders must be unique to the female mother needs in the types of programming that's offered and just the way that the program approaches the female offender. Work release and restitution centers focus on the offender maintaining employment while ensuring that they can pay back their victim. Boot camps are one type of shock incarceration. The offender must voluntarily participate, and selection comes from the prison populations. So this includes intensive aftercare as a very important element to, again, ensuring that the offender retains what they learned while within that camp. And lastly, boot camps do not show any evidence of reducing recidivism as halfway houses and other RCCFs do. So this was your Chapter 8 lecture on community-based residential facilities for offenders. Have a great week, everyone.